At the end of the 19th century, there was a general fascination in Europe with anything exotic or oriental. In fact, some of the biggest events that took place towards the end of the 19th century were these huge world fairs held in Paris called Exposition Universelle. In 1900, Mahler took the Vienna Philharmonic to Paris to play a few concerts at the Exposition Universelle. And the funny thing is, well, funny now, is that they didn't manage to sell those concerts very well, and they didn't have enough money to come back. They actually had to borrow money to be able to come back to Vienna. I wonder if that's how tours used to be done those days. Let's just take the orchestra somewhere and play some concerts and hopefully make enough money to be able to bring the orchestra back. Well, it's not how it happens these days. Just tomorrow I'm going on tour to Spain with my orchestra. Hopefully we have the way back all secure. But going back to Mahler and Orient, well, one of the characteristics of this Exposition Universelle was that a huge part of the whole exhibition was dedicated to what was at the time colonial displays, either of people coming from the colonies or artifacts or anything to do, with the colonies. I guess it was a way for the big empires before the First World War to, impress, show their, power and influence. So, in one of the previous Exposition Universelle, for example, it was where Debussy had the chance to hear for the first time gamelan band play, and of course he was very, very impressed and influenced by that. And many of the artists who went to see this Exposition Universelle felt inspired by the exotic and the Orient they encountered there. But it was, as I said before, it was just a general fascination at the time, all through Europe, with that. If you think about it, even before that, Gauguin, for example, found a new inspiration in the exotic and ended up living to Martinique and then to Tahiti. Puccini, for example, he wrote Madame Butterfly and Turandot. So, it was something new and refreshing for artists to look to the Orient and the exotic. So it was maybe a matter of time for Mahler to, get some inspiration from that too. But something else terrible happened to him. In 1907, he was dismissed from his job at Vienna Opera, which was an awful blow to him, because that was, of course, the most prestigious job in the world at the time as a conductor. And only a few months later, his eldest daughter fell ill with scarlet fever and diphtheria and died. And not long after the funeral, Mahler himself was diagnosed with an untreatable heart condition. At the time, the cardiologs had this view that if you had a heart condition, you shouldn't make much effort, you shouldn't walk long distances, you shouldn't cycle perhaps. And this was especially bad for Mahler. It affected him a lot because his long walks in the mountain were part of his compositional process. We know from his letters to Bruno Walter how much he suffered because he was not able to go on his walks. And he just felt like he couldn't write any music without that. So during that summer, 1907, he didn't write anything. On top of that, also, his marriage was kind of falling apart too. But then, in 1908, he had a chance to read a book called The Chinese Flute, which was a collection of Chinese poems translated from other translations by Hans Bethge. Now, I have specified translated from other translations because the final German poems that Mahler read weren't perhaps entirely faithful to the Chinese originals, but they still kept the Oriental feel and a lot of the original content of the poem still. But with one or two of the poems, because of translation after translation, it was difficult to identify exactly which Chinese poem was the original model. Now I think we know exactly what poems come from what, and in fact there are now even a few recordings of Das Lied von der Erde sung in Cantonese. But going back to the poems, the reason for which Mahler felt suddenly inspired by this book, by these poems, was because many of them dealt with death and with the individual person facing death or on the border between life and death. And having gone through what he went through recently, that was particularly meaningful to Mahler. Unfortunately for him, he never had the chance to hear Das Lied von der Erde played, but he seemed like he wasn't particularly keen after he finished it to have it played, because he thought the piece was very dark. He asked Bruno Walter if he didn't think that the audience would just go and basically shoot themselves after hearing the piece. Now, I know for Mahler, every note he wrote had great significance, and this is at times a very dark piece of music, Das Lied von der Erde, but it has a lot of contrast. It has huge beauty and at times even like happiness, even though it comes, let's say, when referred, well, happiness that happened in the past, let's say, not necessarily what someone feels now, or that happiness that someone feels now is rather replaced by resignation, is not really happiness. But we'll get to that when we go through the songs. But Mahler was worried that people would find it just too dark, and in some ways, after he finished the piece, he just closed the manuscript and put it away, well, after showing it to Bruno Walter at least. And the first performance of the piece only happened 6 months after Mahler died. And just one thing comes to my mind, that almost by some weird coincidence, the first performance of Das Lied von der Erde happened 3 years before the First World War, and the first recording of Das Lied von der Erde, again with Bruno Walter and Vienna Philharmonic, happened 3 years pretty much before the beginning of the Second World War. And that just makes me think of something else, that Bruno Walter, unfortunately because of the circumstances at the time in Austria and Germany, soon after had to escape Austria because he was Jewish. And maybe that's not directly related to Mahler, but in some ways it is, because Mahler himself was Jewish and suffered at times from discrimination and anti-Semitism. And if you think about it, quite a few of the musicians in the Vienna Philharmonic later, not long after that recording that they make with Das Lied von der Erde, would end up in concentration camps, and some of them would die, which is terrible. I don't know, when I listen to that recording, it just makes me think sometimes of that. Because of course the Jewishness was an important part of Mahler. I'm not Jewish myself, but it's definitely an important part in his life and his compositions. Going back to the origins and creation of Das Lied von der Erde, one other thing to mention, I guess, is the fact that Mahler from the very beginning thought of this piece as a symphony and not really as a song cycle. We know that because he mentioned the piece while working on it to Bruno Walter and referred to it as a symphony, and later that he named the piece symphony for alto or baritone and tenor. Now, the the fact that he called this a symphony initially, because he was very, very superstitious, presented him with a problem, because this would have been his ninth symphony, and as he was superstitious, he worried very much that writing a ninth symphony would mean that he would die soon after, because of many of the great composers died soon after writing their ninth symphony. He was certainly aware of Bruckner and Beethoven, maybe not aware of Schubert and Dvorak, but if he had known, he would have been even more worried about it. So he avoided giving an official number to Das Lied von der Erde, and instead the next symphony, of course, he called Symphony Number 9, and as faith, goes, and he actually died while working on Symphony Number 10, so Symphony Number 9 was his last symphony. Perhaps if he had numbered Das Lied von der Erde Symphony Number 9, he would have made it to Symphony Number 10. Who knows? I'm not superstitious myself. He would have died at the same time. It's no question about it. But it's an interesting thing. He was very, very superstitious. We know that through his career. I mean, think about his Sixth Symphony with the hammer blows and that sort of stuff. Or Kindertotenlieder, for example. Now I'm very, very anxious to get to the actual songs, and I think the next video will be instead now focusing on the first song and so on. I think I'll go to the music, because that's why I'm making these videos. I want to get the music and discuss the music in the songs and so on. So I'm looking forward to that, and hopefully I have time soon to make the next video. Thank you for watching this, and see you in the next video.